When Wilson Cruz started unzipping his uniform, did anyone else think that it got hot in here? Because it certainly got hot in here for me. Don't judge me for that. Hello, interwebs, and welcome to my review of the third episode of the fifth and final season of Star Trek Discovery. This episode titled Jinaal, and I am just going to warn you in advance, I lost the second magnet for this Starfleet badge here, so it might just flip upside down at different points. I'm trying to angle it and rest it on my boobs, but Starfleet uniform badge is not exactly boob friendly. I mean, I'm certainly a boob magnet. Alright, well, Gene Roddenberry would have been proud of that joke. Anyways, let's actually get into this review of this episode. As per usual, I will stay spoiler-free up front for this episode in particular, though I may mention stuff that has come up in prior episodes of the season, so be warned on that. And then I will get into full spoilers for the episode in just a little bit with a warning. But staying with my more general thoughts for now, I have to say I really adored this episode with a few caveats on a couple storylines here and there, but to call it the thing that I loved the most this episode, I have to say Wilson Cruz delivered a phenomenally fun performance this episode. Without spoiling it too much, just every single second Wilson Cruz does a particular acting choice this episode, I was just reveling in it and just having so much joy at seeing him have fun. And that is particularly because it surrounds my favorite aliens in all of Star Trek. If you know me, you already know what I'm going to say. The Trill. Yes, as was teased last episode, we take a trip to Trill as part of the next leg in this journey towards the progenitor tech this season. And I just have to say right up front, while the Trill are my favorite aliens in all of Star Trek, the planet Trill itself, not my favorite planet. It's mostly just those damn caves. And I like the caves. There's a lot of pool of water, it's glowing, and there's little slug monsters in it. What's not to love? But there are other planets that I like in Star Trek, even though I love the Trill. But regardless, Wilson Cruz just gets to have fun this episode, and I adored all of the pulling from canon that this episode does when it comes to the Trill, as well as its additional canon as it provides in this larger Indiana Jones-esque scavenger hunt that we've been on this season so far, looking for the progenitor tech. We get to learn a little bit more about the backstory of how this journey that our characters are on got set up in the first place, which is a lot of fun, all tying together with a specific reason that the journey is set up in this way. And it mainly centers around this episode's theme of connection and why it's important to find connection with other people. Which brings me to the other three storylines this episode, two of which I loved, one of which I didn't. There is a storyline here with Saru and T'Rina. If you were worried that Saru was leaving the show after last episode, do not worry, he's still involved, and I really adored his stuff here. It is phenomenal. And we also get another storyline here with the new character, formerly Captain Rayner, who I also really adored. I have to say, the character of Rayner is walking a very fine line that I think may not work for everybody, but is especially working for me. And that line is a character who is meant to be unlikable, but someone who we want to see redeem themselves and actually get to connect and grow as a person. Very often with those types of characters, it can lean one way or the other, where we end up more often than not hating them and not really wanting to see them on our screens anymore, or conversely, they may end up being a character that we really love and aren't really that big of an asshole and don't really need all that much redemption. But Captain Rayner here, I think, is actually fitting right in that golden spot where he is an asshole, and there are moments where I'm like, what the fuck are you doing, dude? But then there are just these small brief glimpses, both in the performance and in the writing, of a man who I want to actually get to know and see and grow with. And those moments are just like precious gold and exactly what this type of character's journey needs. And I also think in particular what I love about his character, and this might get to be a little bit of a spicy take here, but I think his character is not only intended to be a commentary on the character of Lorca, as I mentioned in my past two reviews of the season, as well as Burnham herself and how she's grown over the series, as some of you pointed out in the comments below, which I actually think is a very astute analysis, and I think kind of relates to my commentary on him being related to Lorca, given that Burnham herself was also a somewhat fractured mirror of Lorca in season 1. But also, I think Rayner is, especially after this episode, working as a rebuttal against all of those critiques that, let's just say, certain people have on the internet towards Star Trek Discovery, namely around this idea that Star Trek Discovery is too emotional and that everyone in Starfleet should be militaristic and have protocol and be cold and distanced and work with efficiency and make sure they get everything done on time because that's what Captain Picard and Captain Kirk used to do back in the day. I don't think those nostalgia goggles are true, but that is a criticism that has been unfairly or fairly wielded against Star Trek Discovery, that it is a more emotional Star Trek. But in my opinion, that is what I love about Discovery. It is a more emotional style Star Trek show. It is a show about how our emotions are just as important to understand and cultivate as our scientific processes, because those two things come married together and help us work forward to build that better society. They aren't separate things, but work in conjunction. If we ignore one at the expense of the other, or regardless of the other, it can lead us to becoming a fascist style society, as we saw in season 1, or a society that does not actually work to connect itself and closes itself off, as we've seen with the post-Burn Federation in the other seasons of Discovery. And Captain Rayner in specific, as I'll talk about more in spoilers section, is a character who kind of fits that mold that all of these certain criticizers of Star Trek Discovery seem to want. The guy who's cold, distant, just looks for efficiency, just gets things done, here's what I need to know, and we're gonna get back on the mission, none of this foo-foo emotional stuff. And Discovery is taking a moment to really look at that and say why that is actually not only not helpful, but actually harmful to ourselves and to our mission. And I really, really love that, and I think they're doing a fantastic job with Rayner in that regard that I'll talk more about in the spoiler section. That all being said, this does lead me to my major criticism of this episode, and that is the storyline around Gray and Adira. I'll talk about this more in the spoiler section, but I have to say, while I did not hate this episode, and there's a few things that I like in terms of the concepts with these characters that they're using this episode, I particularly found it to be kind of a nothing burger in terms of my emotional investment in what's going on with these two. Mostly because it feels so ancillary and tacked on to everything else that's happening in this show so far this season. And that's not to say I don't think that it's not well written or not interesting or doesn't make sense, but just that it feels kind of nebulously there. And as a result, I'm having a hard time to really get invested in what's going on with these two characters, especially because we haven't had as much screen time with these two as I would have liked to really be invested in their relationship. We've gotten pieces of it, certainly, but not as much as I would want to really make what this episode's trying to do land in the way that I think it really wants it to land. But overall, I think this is a wonderful, kind of slower-paced episode compared to the last two more action-heavy episodes that I think really hones in on the Star Trek Discovery theme of the desire to connect being a core part of what makes us fight for that better world of the Star Trek tomorrow. But before I can talk more about all of that, I have to get into spoilers. So if you have not seen the episode, jump ship here. Just don't go into space, because that would be bad. You'd probably die from, you know, the lack of oxygen or the cold. Alright, now that we are in the spoiler section, let me try and fix this. Okay, it's just gonna stay like that for the rest of this review. Anyways, we're gonna talk spoilers, and I have my notes. Let's talk about this episode piece by piece. And looking at my notes here, I think it's probably gonna make the most sense to not break this episode down chronologically, but by each individual storyline. So let's just break it down. We start off the episode with the Discovery going to Trill itself, and Burnham interrogating Book about what they've learned about Maul and Locke, and Burnham being worried about Book's relationship to Maul, which is understandable considering it could mean that he'd have conflicting interests, but Book is trying to say, look, I am focused on this mission, I'm trying to pay my dues for what I did last season, and just trust me and let me come on this mission with you to prove that to you, which Burnham does. I like that as a good setup for their characters as they're trying to learn how to reconnect with each other and trust each other after their time apart and the distrust that built between them after the events of last season. I also really love this addition to Star Trek lore that we find where we learn that there were spots on the clue that we found last episode that basically are like a fingerprint for Trill spots tied to a singular individual, and this individual being one of a prior host of a symbiont from way back in the 24th century of the Next Generation era. Thought that was just a cool idea of like spots being like fingerprints. That I loved that concept. Also, I really love that moment where Wilson Cruz says, "It's my job," to Burnham when she asks about, does he remember every single detail? Wilson Cruz just has this lovely warmth about him. I've met him actually in person a couple times back when I worked at The Advocate, and he was just sweet every single time that I met him in real life. So that warmth that he brings across on screen is very much just a part of who he is, at least from my brief interactions with him. We then arrive at Trill, and Guardian Z comes up onto the ship to ask Burnham a riddle that she needs to give the answer to in order to progress in their journey. I loved how this was set up, that it was very mysterious. Burnham couldn't even broach a question about why she was being asked this riddle. That being said, though, the riddle itself felt a little bit like a nothing burger, considering that we had kind of learned the answer to it last episode when we learned that the fourth stanza pointed towards Beta Z and it was sort of a false direction. And I feel like the actual riddle that they used here could have been something, I think, a bit more pertinent to the episode's themes. But that being said, I don't really exactly know how you would have done that. So it was just one of those, like, I love the concept. The execution was like, all right, it's a fine enough riddle, I guess. All it seemed to prove was that they had discovered the last crew and were smart enough to figure out the entirety of the clue and not just its misdirection. And then we go down to our favorite Trill cave pools where all the slugs hang out, as they say. You know, us queer folks love to hang out in the slug pools. And we learn that in order to be able to get the next clue, they're going to have to speak to Jinaal, the original host of the symbiote that is in this older woman now, directly. And in order to do that, they're going to have to do a Jantara, which is a ritual that we actually saw way back in Deep Space Nine, where a prior host of a symbiote can telepathically take over someone's body. It was a weird episode when they did it in Deep Space Nine. Captain Sisko was absolutely terrifying as the murder host.
Then let me show you how to use it. Lower the force field, Jadzia.
And then Odo tried to be Curzon for a little while. It was very weird, and I love seeing it come back here, most especially because Culber decides to take on that burden of holding the host of Jinaal, and when he becomes Jinaal, Wilson Cruz just kills it as this guy. I did not think Wilson Cruz could become hotter. Sadly, he is gay, so I'm out of the running, but man is very sexy. When he started unbuttoning his shirt and just having that little gravelly voice with the accent, I'm like, you're killing me. You're killing me, Wilson Cruz. And I love Jinaal. I just remember the path. And at first I was a bit disappointed in where this clue was leading them because it just seemed like, oh yeah, the clue's just around the back end. We were just gonna take a little hike and there's the clue that people have missed apparently for 800 freaking years, which felt a little bit disappointing, but that is sort of subverted by episode's end, and I did like that. However, on their walk, we did get to learn a little bit more about the backstory of this search for the progenitor tech that our main characters are on. Namely, that Jinaal was part of a group of scientists that were supposed to study the progenitors after the episode of The Chase in The Next Generation, and they eventually did find that technology, but because they found it to be dangerous, and one of their sort of scientist friends died upon finding the technology in a very dark way, which I'm assuming we'll learn a little bit more about as the season goes on, they decided that they had to hide the tech, most especially because the Dominion War was going on, the Dominion War from Deep Space Nine, and they did not think that the Federation, especially as it's becoming more hawkish, as we saw between not only Deep Space Nine, but also into the beginnings of Star Trek Picard as well, that they could trust the Federation or anyone with this tech and wanted to save it for a time of peace. Which he then asks Burnham and Book if now is that time. And I appreciate that Burnham answered honestly that yes, it was currently a time of peace, but that is not always going to be the case, and progress is not always linear. And so you just kind of have to trust and hope that people will fight for the greater good regardless of what is going on, and that will win the day. That's a very Star Trekian message. It's pragmatic in the sense that saying, like, look, war and conflict is going to happen, which is a theme of this entire episode overall, but that we will ultimately work to resolve it. And that is hopefully how we end up progressing regardless of conflict. All of this eventually leads to them coming across these Trill animals that can cloak themselves. I loved the design of these guys. And Burnham and Book trying to get the clue that Jinaal had placed there. And I love that Janaal's like, peace, I'm out. I don't want to get Wilson Cruz hurt because this man's too beautiful. So you guys deal with this. And Book and Burnham trying to figure it out, but eventually learning after they worked out how to communicate amongst themselves, the two of them, kind of helping their relationship grow a little bit. They're also able to realize that they've been accidentally antagonizing these creatures because they are trying to protect their babies, and decide to back off and say, look, we don't deserve to bother these animals at the expense of us figuring the clue out, so we'll back off and come back at another time. And that actually being what Jinaal's test was. He was trying to test them to be able to see if they would actually back down, or if they just viewed everything as an enemy and wanted to try to just take what they wanted for themselves, that being the true test. I absolutely adored that and thought that was really very sweet, and I think that that is, again, a very Star Trek-y message that we can then carry on into our other storylines. This theme of, conflict being something that is going to inherently always come up, but it's about how we choose to resolve those conflicts and how we choose to connect and be empathetic with others that matters most, whether we respect them or see them as lesser. And this first comes up with Captain Rayner's storyline because Burnham asks him to try to get to know each member of the crew. And I love Rayner's first response to this, where he's like, look, I need to be of use, and this is not the best way to use me. I can better focus on Maul and Locke. And even when he has meetings scheduled with each crew member, he's still trying to figure out the Maul and Locke situation, is not really paying attention to them. And even when Stamets comes in and is very excited about learning some information about the progenitor tech, Rayner is only really interested in how it's useful to him. And this goes back to something that I was talking about with Captain Lorca back in season 1 of Discovery, and a lot of how fascists and systems that try to, dictate what people are supposed to be ultimately do, which is view people for use. And Rayner is very much that kind of guy. He sees himself of use. He wants everything to be efficient, especially his time and especially his crew members, instead of them being full people and not enabling them to be themselves. And I thought that this episode, breaking down this idea through his look, tell me something about yourself, just give me something efficient that I can use, that I can analyze, rather than getting to know you, is a great breakdown of that type of mentality. This is not to say that Captain Rayner is a fascist or something like that, but that mentality is what leads to that. As also this viewing everybody as antagonistic or something to be used, or as an enemy if they are not of use to him or his time. Also, this leads to some fun little moments with the crew, just having 20 words to be able to express themselves. I thought Reno saying, last time I got chips, and also Linus being like, we reproduce asexually, was really wonderful. And I did love at the end, Tilly calling Rayner out, which again, I'm sure some particular people on the internet will be like, oh, look, she didn't follow military command, she would have been thrown out, she would have been court-martialed for that, blah, blah, blah. It's like, the point of this episode and this show is to say that Starfleet is not a military. It has a military structure and has some elements of the military, but it is different in that it enables people to be their best selves. And I love that Discovery is kind of taking aim at that concept. And Tilly calling Rayner out and saying, look, you can't view people this way. And in the bar at the end of the episode with Rayner saying, look, I did analyze these people. I do know them a little bit. And Tilly saying, yeah, you can analyze them, and I'm glad that you were listening. You're not a complete asshole. And I think that that was part of the redemptive part of his character that I really thought worked well with him, is that he's not a complete dick and just does not care to hear anything that he's being told about these people, but he has to see them as more than just their efficiency, their use, what he can sort of glean from them in these small moments, and actually take the time to get to know them as people and respect them as people. And it's that choice, as Burnham said at the beginning of the episode, the choice to connect is what's most important. So absolutely loving the needle that they are threading with Rayner, both as a critique of both how Burnham has grown, the Star Trek Discovery as a whole, as well as the criticism that people have leveled against Star Trek Discovery, in my opinion, unfairly, or at the very least, misunderstanding what Star Trek Discovery is trying to say. Again, my opinion, your mileage may vary, and that's totally okay. But from there, let's jump over to a storyline in this episode that I did not like, which is Adira and Gray. I don't have a ton to say about this storyline, but mainly just to voice my somewhat disappointment that this relationship between a non-binary character and a trans-masculine character, something we very rarely get to see in television, let alone science fiction, is coming to an end, presumably, in this episode. And, there's still 7 more episodes of the season. Maybe there is much more that we will get out of these two characters. I'm certainly hoping so. But it is saddening to me because this type of relationship gets very little representation, despite it being a very, common style of relationship within the queer and even trans non-binary communities. I just really loved it, and so I was a little bit disappointed by it. That all being said, I have to temper my somewhat disappointment in this choice to say that I do understand where they're going for with it in terms of the theme of this episode, which is to say that conflict arises and how you choose to resolve it is important. And I did really like that both Adira and Gray choose to end this relationship on very kind, friendly, and mutual terms. There's often depiction in media of breakups have to be this hard, cruel, and painful thing in terms of what you do to each other. And while breakups are almost always painful, they don't need to be cruel. Sometimes people just drift apart. I've been in those situations, and I am very much friends with all of my exes for the most part. I'm trying to think if there's any exes that I don't like. And this idea that breakups have to be, you know, you never see this person again, you stop caring about them, and it comes out of like hatred for each other. It's like, ugh, my ex, ugh, I hate her. I think it's a very toxic ideal, and I think it's really beautiful to see a breakup happen that is mutual and not just out of anything that either person did wrong or that they don't fit, but just they're on different paths in their life. And I think that kind of, again, fits the episode's theme of connection being a choice, and sometimes you have to choose to follow your own path, and that's okay, and you can do that in a mutually kind way. And I think that works even most especially for the fact these are two young characters. I mean, kids break up all the time at that age. It's just naturally just part of, you're doing a lot of things at that age, you're going to try out different things, and hey, sometimes the path that you're on is not always going to be the one that you're going to walk on together. But this does lead me to another criticism of the storyline, in that it just kind of feels ancillary. Again, I don't want to be too critical in the sense that, like, it makes sense that this would happen. We are taking a trip to Trill. It's very hard for me to get invested in it in the sense that it just seems sort of tacked on to everything else that's been happening. And I do understand that, like, not everything needs to tie into the grander narrative. I mean, Saru and T'Rina's storyline that I'll talk about in a second doesn't. But here, for me, it just, I don't know, it just doesn't seem to fit as well. And I think that perhaps comes down to the fact that we really haven't seen Adira and Gray all that much on screen since pretty much the middle of season 4. I do really like their relationship, but we've only gotten it in bits and spurts throughout seasons 3 and 4 of Discovery. And so when it ends here, I feel a little bit of something because I do care about this representation. I do care about these characters. I like them both. I like the actors as well. But in terms of them ending, I'm not really super invested in the relationship because I haven't seen all that much of it. And while I do think thematically it resonates, I think on an emotional level, I think it would be more powerful just to see this relationship grow in a kind of healthy way, because I would like to see more of that side of relationship. And maybe later on down the line, maybe they break up for similar reasons, but I just don't think we've really earned the emotional payoff of what this is trying to get at here. Maybe that's just me. Again, your mileage may vary, but I do think this doesn't hit as hard as it possibly could have done if we had gotten more of their relationship prior to this, or if they had shown more of it this season going forward and maybe hit this point later on. All that being said, let's enter the storyline that I did really love, which is Saru and T'Rina's stuff. I, again, adore this relationship so much. T'Rina and Saru are adorable. Them putting out an announcement and Saru sort of like saying, oh, can we nix the handsome and erudite Saru part of the message? And her being like, it is accurate. I'm just being, you know, I'm a Vulcan. I just speak facts. I'm just spitting facts. You're a hot Kelpian dude. What can I say? I thought that was adorable. And I do like this idea of how Saru is trying to navigate having not only a relationship, but one that's in the political sphere. And him being told by T'Rina's aide that her political career with the Vulcan purists would be in jeopardy if she announced a wedding with someone like Saru who is not Vulcan. And this particularly rang to me interestingly because it had this element of racism within it. That Vulcan purists are kind of, they sound like eugenicists. They want people to remain purely Vulcan, which is absolute nonsense with the Navari ideal that we've seen come up within Star Trek Discovery, in that Vulcans and Romulans have now intermingled, and while they share a common history, they are very much different styles of people. So these Vulcan purists, which reminds me very much of the logic extremists we saw in Enterprise and earlier seasons of Discovery, feel like racists. And so I highly doubt T'Rina is like, I need to worry about appealing to the racists in my society right now. But Saru kind of playing that political calculus and basically saying like, I want to care about her, I want to try and protect her. And T'Rina, when Saru brings it up, is like, I don't need protection. By choosing to do this, you're not respecting me as a person. I can handle myself, and I want you as my partner, not my protector. I thought that was just a wonderful, wonderful message. And again, I just love Discovery for its emotional, depthful understanding of not only just individual emotions, but also just how our relationships should be built with others in a positive and healthy way, even when conflict is going to be a part of that. But it's our choice in how we resolve that is important. And I love Saru apologizing, saying, I'm going to be your partner, I'll stand beside you, and T'Rina saying, you know, I won't hold a grudge, this is just what happens, we'll figure it out as we go. That's part of the joy of being in a relationship and caring about others. It's not something to be worried about or feared, but just something to, you know, understand and deal with maturely, which sadly a lot of our fiction and our society generally does not always do, especially when it comes to relationships. Also, during the negotiation scenes, we got a brief mention that there's been a build-up of Breen forces that was also name-checked last episode, which has me wondering if the Breen are going to be a larger and larger threat this season, and ultimately tying into the idea that we see introduced this episode of there always going to be conflict arising, and it's how we handle that conflict that defines who we are going to be. So I'm curious to see how the menacing threat of the Breen this season will tie into the larger narrative, as that seems like a long game that this season is going to try to play. Also, it's worth mentioning the really beautiful scene between Burnham and Culber at the end of this episode, where Culber reminisces about his abuela, a woman who actually had a lot of religious iconography in her life to remind her that not all things need definitive answers, and both Burnham and Culber being people that find that to be uncomfortable, especially with them both being people of science. And I adored this ending because it speaks to this idea that yes, as scientists, we want to uncover, we want to learn more, we want to solve the mysteries of the cosmos, but not all mysteries have answers, especially when it comes to emotions and our ability to connect with each other. Some things are not always quantifiable, or easy to make of use or efficient, as we see with the character of Rayner. Sometimes things just happen, people drift apart. And so I really like this concept of not all things having answers being brought up in this episode, very much about how things just naturally arise that we can't always resolve neatly, but we always aim to try to do so. So I'm curious to see how that theme of needing the answers to everything solved will tie into this larger concept and discussion that this season seems to be having. So ultimately, at the end of the day, while I do have one major hesitation with this episode, I did end up really enjoying it overall. It's a slower paced episode, but it ties into some of my favorite elements of Star Trek lore, as well as giving some fantastic acting opportunities to some of my favorite characters on the show, as well as tying in some wonderful themes that underscore Star Trek Discovery's greatest strengths in its emotional maturity. Overall, this is another great episode of the season. I can't wait for this season to continue, but what did you all think of this episode? I'd love to hear that down below, and as always, my friends, live long and prosper.